On the morning of the 30th of January 1649, a small man asked for a second shirt. The day was bitterly cold, the Thames had frozen hard enough to walk on, and the man who made the request understood exactly what the cold could do to a body standing exposed before a crowd. He was afraid, he said, that shivering might be mistaken for fear. So he put on 2 shirts and he stepped through a window of his own palace onto a scaffold draped in black. He was 48 years old. He had stammered since childhood and had never quite grown to the height other men reached. He was, by every account of those who stood near him at the end, entirely calm. Below the scaffold, held back by ranks of soldiers, waited the largest silence London had ever kept. His name was Charles Stuart, and he was the King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, the first and only king these islands would ever try and put to death by the will of his own subjects. There are 2 Charles I's in the memory of the world, and both of them are lies. One is the saint in lace, the royal martyr, murdered by fanatics for the crime of being a king. The other is the tyrant who reached too far and was justly broken. This is the story of neither. It is the story of the man who wore 2 shirts against the cold, a devoted husband, a tender father, the greatest collector of beauty ever to sit on the English throne, sincere and courageous, and utterly, fatally sure of himself. A good man, and as a king a catastrophe. Both of those things are true, and this film will not let go of either. He was not supposed to be king. That single fact, more than any doctrine or any battle, is the key to everything that followed. And to understand the man who died on that scaffold, one has to begin with the child nobody expected to live. Charles was born on the 19th of November 1600 in the royal palace of Dunfermline in Scotland, the second surviving son of James VI, King of Scots. He was a weak and ailing infant, so frail that he was baptized quickly and privately, as though the family were not sure how long they would have him. When his father inherited the throne of England 3 years later, becoming James I of a united crown, and carrying the whole court south to London in triumph, the little Duke of Albany was judged too sickly to make the journey, and so, while England celebrated its new dynasty, Charles was left behind in Scotland with his nurses, the child too weak to travel. He was slow in every way a child can be slow. He did not walk until well past the age when other children ran. His legs were weak, and by some accounts he was fitted with iron braces or reinforced boots to strengthen them, though the exact nature of the affliction is lost to us, and the details should be held lightly. He was slow to speak too, and when speech came, it came haltingly. The stammer that seized him as a boy would never leave him. All his life in council and in Parliament, and at the last upon the scaffold, Charles would have to fight his own tongue for every sentence, pressing through the blockages, forcing out words that stuck, the effort visible on his face. For a prince whose whole trade was to be seen and heard and obeyed, it was a cruel inheritance, and it was made crueler by comparison because Charles did not grow up alone. He grew up in the shadow of a brother who was everything he was not. Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, was 6 years older, and he was the sun around which the young Stuart court revolved. Where Charles was small and halting, Henry was tall and athletic and magnificent. He rode, he fenced, he commanded. He loved soldiers and ships and the hard Protestant vigor of the age. Poets wrote of him as the hope of the nation, the prince who would one day lead England against the Catholic powers of Europe and make her great. The whole apparatus of expectation that surrounds a future king had settled upon Henry's shoulders, and he wore it as though he had been born for it, which of course he had. Beside that brilliance, the younger boy could only seem to disappear. Charles was the spare, loved, no doubt, but secondary, a reserve piece kept off to the side of the board. Then, in the autumn of 1612, the board was overturned. That October, Henry fell ill. It began as a fever and grew worse. The physicians of the day bled him and purged him and could do nothing. By the end of the month he was delirious, and on the 6th of November 1612, Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, died. He was 18 years old. The diagnosis that history has settled on is typhoid fever, though at the time there were the inevitable dark whispers of poison, and those whispers should be treated as the rumours they were. What is beyond dispute is the scale of the grief. England mourned as for a king it would now never have. The court went into black, and the poets who had celebrated Henry's promise turned to elegy. And in a single stroke, the sickly second son, the small, stammering boy who had been left behind in Scotland, the reserve nobody had trained to rule, became the heir to 3 kingdoms. It is worth pausing on what that meant, because it shaped the whole tragedy to come. Charles had not been raised to be king. He had been raised beside the person who would be king, watching, deferring, a step behind. He had none of Henry's easy command, none of his martial glamour, none of the years of preparation that a proper heir received. What he had instead was the character that a frail and overlooked child develops in a court that prizes strength, a fierce, private discipline. He drove his weak body to master horsemanship until he sat a horse as well as any man in England. He wrestled his stammer into something like silence, learning to speak seldom and to weigh each word so that his very reticence came to seem like dignity rather than difficulty. He built around himself a wall of reserve and ceremony, and behind that wall he kept his fears and his griefs entirely to himself. He learned, in short, that a prince's face must never once betray him, and he learned the lesson so well that he would carry it unbroken all the way to the block. The ceremonies of his new station came to him one by one, and he wore them the way he wore everything, correctly and a little stiffly. In 1616 he was created Prince of Wales in his own right, invested with the title that had been his dead brother's, standing where Henry should have stood, and receiving the homage a nation had meant for another man. He grew serious about the things a king ought to know. Theology above all, for he was genuinely devout, and the law and the governing of a court. But he took his deepest lessons not from his tutors, but from the atmosphere around him, from a father who lectured him on the sacred mystery of kingship, and from his own daily labour of turning a frail and stammering body into an instrument fit to be looked at. He became a connoisseur of order, of ceremony done properly, of pictures hung well, of a household that moved like clockwork, because order was the one thing a careful man could impose on a world that had already shown him how little it could be trusted. There was much in all of this to admire, and one great absence at the centre of it. Nowhere in his long and careful making did anyone think to teach him how to yield. There was something else he absorbed in those years, quietly and completely, and it would matter more than anything. His father, James, was a scholar king with a theory of his own greatness. James believed and wrote in books that circulated through Europe that kings were made by God and answered to God alone, that a monarch was the Lord's anointed lieutenant on earth, above the reach of any parliament or court or subject. To James, this was partly a debating position, a thing he argued with the flexibility of a clever man who also knew when to bend. But the son took it in without the father's suppleness. Charles received the doctrine of divine right not as an argument to be deployed, but as a truth to be lived, sunk to the marrow, unbending and absolute. The idea that would one day make him refuse to answer his own judges was planted in the reserved and watchful boy long before he understood where it would lead. By his late teens he had a new figure in his life too, for the Golden Brothers' place was not left wholly empty. Into it stepped a young man of dazzling beauty and boundless ambition named George Villiers, the rising favourite of the old king, whom James loved and petted, and called by the pet name Steenie. To the lonely, formal prince, Villiers became something between a brother and an idol, the confident, charming companion Charles himself could never be. In time, Villiers would be raised to be Duke of Buckingham, the most powerful subject in the kingdom, and the two young men would become inseparable. It was a friendship that would carry Charles into the first great folly of his life. For now, though, he was still only the heir, a careful, self-contained young man, growing slowly into a role he had never been meant to fill, schooled by frailty into a discipline that looked like grace and armoured by a belief in his own God-given authority that would one day have no give in it at all. He would grow into the part slowly, this careful, watchful boy, mastering the weak legs, wrestling the stammer into silence, learning above all that a prince's face must never once betray him. But he had also learned to love one man beyond all reason, a dazzling and dangerous favourite his own father called Steenie. And in the spring of 1623 the two of them would do a thing no heir to the English throne had ever dared. They would pull false beards over their faces, ride for the coast under invented names, and gallop clear across a continent to steal a bride from the court of England's greatest enemy. The ride to Madrid began as a marriage treaty and turned into a hallucination of romantic ambition, an attempt to leap over the glacial pace of 17th-century diplomacy by the sheer force of a prince's presence. For the better part of a decade, James had pursued a vision of European peace through an alliance with Spain, the greatest power in the world. It was a policy of deliberate pragmatism, meant to keep England clear of the religious wars already tearing the continent apart, and, not incidentally, to secure the vast dowry that the Infanta Maria Anna would carry into a treasury that was perpetually short of cash. But the negotiations had dragged on year after year, mired in the labyrinthine demands of the Habsburgs and the deep suspicion of the English public. This was a country that still marked the anniversary of the gunpowder plot with bonfires. To the ordinary Londoner, a Spanish marriage meant popery, foreign entanglement, and the betrayal of the Protestant cause. To the young Charles it had become something else entirely, a test of his own resolve, and a stage on which he might at last act the part of a man of consequence. In February 1623, he and Buckingham acted. They shed their titles and their retinues, pulled false beards over their faces, and took the pedestrian aliases of Tom and John Smith. With a tiny party of companions, among them Endymion Porter and Sir Francis Cottington, men who knew Spain and its tongue, they rode out of London in the depth of winter, bent on closing the distance between the Thames and the Tagus on horseback. Charles was 22. It was an act of breathtaking recklessness. Had the heir to 3 kingdoms been recognized, waylaid, or held to ransom on the roads of a hostile Catholic power, the consequences would have been ruinous, and his safety would have rested entirely on the goodwill of whoever discovered him. They pressed on regardless, riding hard across France, pausing incognito in Paris, where by a persistent tradition Charles first glimpsed a French princess dancing at a court entertainment, a girl whose name meant nothing to him then. Before slipping over the Pyrenees into Spain, 2 young men in disguise gambling the security of a kingdom on a gesture. When they reached Madrid, the Spanish court was dumbstruck. No prince of England had ever made such a journey, and the sudden arrival of the heir to the throne, unannounced and in disguise, threw the rigid ceremony of the Spanish monarchy into confusion. At first the gesture was met with a bewildered courtly warmth. King Philip IV received Charles with the elaborate hospitality his rank demanded, lodged him in honour, and opened the treasures of the royal palace to him. For a few weeks the atmosphere was one of glittering pageantry, and Charles, a lover of order, of ceremony, and of beautiful things, was genuinely dazzled by the gravity of the Spanish court, and by the Titians hung upon its walls. He had convinced himself that his boldness had cut through years of haggling at a single stroke, and that by wooing the Infanta in person he would carry her home within weeks. The reality was colder. The men who directed Spanish policy, Philip and his powerful chief minister, the Count Duke of Olivares, were not looking for a romance, but for lasting strategic advantage, and they had no intention of surrendering the Infanta until they had wrung concrete concessions from the English crown. The price they named was steep and, to English ears, impossible. The suspension of the penal laws against England's Catholics, guarantees of toleration, the raising of any royal children as Catholics into their teens, and satisfaction as to the prince's own faith. A marriage between a Catholic princess and a Protestant heir required a dispensation from the Pope, and while Rome deliberated and Madrid raised its terms, Charles was kept at a polite, impenetrable distance. He was a guest, and he was also in every way that mattered a hostage to his own impatience, permitted to see the Infanta only on stiff, formal occasions, always chaperoned, always within the narrow bounds the Spanish chose to set. There is an almost painful quality to the accounts that survive from those months. On one occasion, Charles is said to have scaled a garden wall at the royal residence, hoping to steal a private moment with the woman he had crossed a continent to marry. The sight of the future King of England scrambling over a wall was not the grand stroke of chivalry he had perhaps imagined. The Infanta, startled by the intrusion, cried out and fled, and the episode became a small emblem of how completely the two sides misread one another. Charles was playing a scene from a chivalric romance. The Spanish court watched him with a mixture of amusement and cold calculation, questioned his sincerity, demanded assurances he could not give, and let the delays stretch on through the spring and into the summer while the whole apparatus of Habsburg diplomacy quietly ran out the clock. Charles, meanwhile, was lodged in the old royal Alcazar amid a magnificence that only sharpened the humiliation, feasted and flattered, and no nearer his bride than the day he had arrived. It was in Madrid, in the middle of this courtship, that word came of how highly Charles's father valued the companion at his side. Buckingham was raised to a dukedom, the only man outside the royal family to hold that rank in the whole of the age. But the favourite's temper served the negotiation poorly. Buckingham quarrelled openly with Olivares, and the friction between the two men poisoned what little goodwill survived. By the autumn the shine had gone entirely. Charles had not been won by the Spanish, he had been strung along by them, and he had come to see it. When he finally left for England in October 1623, he went without a bride, without a treaty, and with his pride in ruins. The return brought a revelation that neither he nor Buckingham had foreseen. News of the match's collapse had run ahead of them, and the reaction across England was not the disappointment due a failed royal alliance, but a great outpouring of relief. Bonfires were lit in the streets, church bells rang from every steeple, and crowds cheered the prince, not because he had won the Infanta, but because he had come home without her, untainted by Rome. Charles, who had ridden south as the agent of his father's peace, returned to find himself absurdly a hero of the anti-Spanish cause. He had misjudged his own people as badly as he had misjudged the Spanish court, and he now compounded the error by mistaking their relief for a mandate to make war. The experience hardened him. The reserved prince, who had once accepted the caution of his father's foreign policy, came home hungry for a conflict that might erase the memory of his humiliation. He and Buckingham, now inseparable, and between them the effective masters of English policy, turned from courtship to war. When Parliament assembled in 1624, they used the failure of the match to whip up its anger and win the subsidies for a campaign against Spain, cheered on by the very members who would soon learn to distrust them. If Spain could not be charmed, it would be fought. And having burned the Spanish bridge, the two men turned to the continent's other great Catholic power for a bride, France. The youngest daughter of the late Henry IV and sister of the reigning Louis XIII was young, French and Catholic, and a marriage to her would carry the tensions of the continent straight into the heart of the English court. And in a bitter irony Charles seems never to have weighed, the French set very nearly the same price the Spanish had. Relief for England's Catholics, written this time into a secret article of the treaty, so that the bride he took to spite Madrid bound him to the identical promise he had ridden across a continent to make. The diplomatic pivot was swift. Its consequences would run for a generation. Charles had gone abroad a suitor and returned convinced that the crown he was soon to inherit was an instrument for the enacting of his own will, answerable neither to his subjects nor to their parliament. He had gone to Spain a suitor and come home a warmonger, his pride still smarting from a courtship that had made him a laughing-stock in every court in Europe. Within 18 months his father would be dead, and the crown would be his. And the bride he finally took, a girl of 15, sent from the one throne England distrusted almost as much as Spain, would be a Catholic still. She was called Henrietta Maria, and half his kingdom would never forgive him for loving her. The crown did not descend upon Charles as a sudden, golden epiphany. It arrived on the 27th of March, 1625, at the end of his father's long decline, in a court that had grown heavy and disordered around a dying king. James was gone, and with him the rambling, discursive, faintly squalid style of rule that had defined the previous 2 decades. Charles was 24, and he meant from the first to be a different kind of king. He came to the throne, moreover, in the shadow of catastrophe, for a savage outbreak of plague was scouring London through that summer of 1625, carrying off tens of thousands and scattering the court from the capital even as the new reign began. Where his father had been informal to the point of ribaldry, letting favourites lounge and courtiers crowd the royal presence, the son was formal to the point of austerity. Within weeks he had curbed the easy access men had enjoyed to the king's person, stiffened the etiquette of the household, and imposed a written order of ceremony upon a court that had known little of it. To Charles, the majesty of the throne was a sacred thing that required the protection of ritual, a hushed and ordered space in which the dignity of a divinely appointed monarch could be seen and felt. It was a style that mirrored his temperament, and it served, almost at once, to wall him off from the very people he was meant to lead. That distance was widened by his marriage. The bride was Henrietta Maria, youngest daughter of the assassinated Henry IV of France, and sister to the reigning Louis XIII. The match had been sealed even before James died, a proxy wedding, on the steps of Notre Dame in Paris in the spring of 1625, and then the meeting of the couple in the flesh at Canterbury in June. She was a girl of about 15, raised in the militant Catholicism of the French court, and she came to England trailing a household of French priests and attendants and a set of secret marriage articles that Charles had signed in his hunger for the alliance, promises to suspend the penal laws and grant relief to England's persecuted Catholics that, had they been made public, would have set the Commons ablaze. The union had required a dispensation from the Pope, and it delivered into the heart of Protestant England a queen who would keep her own priests, her own confessor, and her own Catholic chapel open in the royal palaces. He had wanted a partnership that would restore his family's standing in Europe and lend weight to his coming war. What arrived instead was a young wife who spoke no English, a knot of foreign clergy who regarded the English church as a shabby heresy, and a parliament whose suspicion of both hardened by the month. The beginning was a collision of temperaments. Charles, schooled since boyhood in reserve and self-command, found himself yoked to a spirited teenager who would not be managed, and who made no secret of her contempt for the Protestant rights of her new country. Her French entourage formed a court within the court, a defiant pocket of Roman worship at the centre of the royal palace, and the young queen looked to them rather than to her husband. Charles answered coldness with coldness, retreating into wounded formality. And between the two of them stood a third figure who made everything worse, Buckingham, still the son of the king's world, who inserted himself into the royal marriage and managed its quarrels as though the queen were a diplomatic problem to be solved. Henrietta Maria came to hate the Duke. Charles defended him without reservation. By 1626, the estrangement had curdled into open crisis, and the king took the extraordinary step of expelling almost the whole of his wife's French household, sending her priests and attendants back across the Channel and leaving the young queen isolated in a foreign land. She is said, in her distress, to have thrust her hands through a window to call after her servants as they were carried away. For a season, the marriage was a cold and hollow thing, a bargain that soothed no one and deepened the anxieties of the nation. Yet there was another realm in which this reserved and difficult man moved with complete assurance, and it was here that the character of his reign found its most lasting expression. Charles was, by instinct and by long cultivation, a connoisseur. He possessed an eye for painting that had no equal among the monarchs of the age, and in the years after his accession he set about assembling a collection that would come to rank among the greatest ever gathered by a European prince. He was not merely purchasing status, he was hunting the sublime. In a coup that astonished the courts of Europe, his agents negotiated over 1627 and 1628 the purchase of the fabled Gonzaga collection from the Dukes of Mantua, a staggering hoard that brought to England canvases by Titian and Raphael, and the monumental sequence of Mantegna's triumphs of Caesar. 9 great canvases he prized above almost anything he owned. Around these he gathered works of the Italian and Flemish masters, until the galleries of Whitehall held one of the richest collections in Europe, and he began to draw the finest living painters toward his court, so that the shy, small, halting man might be fixed in oils as something else. Cool, commanding, effortlessly a king, Van Dyck, who would one day give that vision its perfect form, had not yet crossed the sea, but the king was already building the world that would summon him. Charles could command a Raphael to be carried to his hand. He could not command the opinions of his parliament, nor still the voices that had begun to read his love of images as a taste for popish idolatry. The strain of the early reign was made visible at the coronation. On the 2nd of February 1626, Charles was anointed and crowned in Westminster Abbey by the rites of the Church of England, and his queen was not beside him. Steadfast in her faith, Henrietta Maria would not take part in a Protestant ceremony, and she watched, if she watched at all, from a distance, an excluded figure while a Protestant bishop set the crown on her husband's head. It was a small wound, but a telling one, and it was of a piece with everything else, a king who saw himself as the guardian of a sacred order that stood above the squabbles of the day, and a people who saw a monarch drifting from them, ringed by foreign influences and favourites who seemed to set their own fortunes above the health of the realm. As the years turned, the ice between Charles and his queen began, slowly, to break. The barriers of language and religion did not fall, but the affection stifled by politics and pride began to find room to grow, and the change accelerated once the third figure who had stood between them was gone. What emerged was one of the great royal love matches of the century, genuine, tender, and, in the end, politically ruinous, because it bound a Protestant king ever more tightly to a Catholic wife whom a great part of his subjects feared and mistrusted. The sovereign, who was a disaster in council, became, in the private rooms of his palaces, a devoted husband and an intensely loving father. Children came, the future Charles II in 1630, a daughter named Mary, then the boy who would reign as James II in 1633 and others after, and the king, who could not carry his own people, plainly adored his family and staked more and more of his judgment upon the survival of it. In time he would have them painted together in great luminous groups, the royal children ranged in silk and lace, images of a domestic happiness as real as it was, in the end, fragile. In the years to come he would lean upon Henrietta Maria's counsel as upon no one else's, and her counsel, again and again, would be to yield nothing. In time he would love her past all reason, and lean on her judgment past all wisdom, but that lay in the future, on the far side of a grief that had not yet come. For now the young king had a court to command, a treasury already empty, and a favourite he could not do without. The whole kingdom watched the Duke of Buckingham with a hatred that grew by the month, and in a Portsmouth tavern an unpaid soldier with a grievance and a tenpenny knife was already thinking about how close a man might get to the most powerful subject in England. The passing of the old king was not merely a change of person, it was a change in the very gravity of the crown. When Charles stepped into his inheritance, he did not see himself as a negotiator, a mediator, or a monarch whose power rested on the consent of his subjects. He saw himself as the Lord's anointed, a king whose authority ran in a direct and vertical line from God to his own person. This was no pose and no cynical maneuver. It was, in every fibre of the man, a sincere and unshakable conviction. He was the keeper of a sacred trust, and the laws of England were not chains upon his will, but instruments placed in his hand to wield. It followed to his mind that any challenge to his prerogative was not a difference of political opinion, but something close to sacrilege. This doctrine of the divine right of kings had been the cornerstone of his father's intellectual life. James had argued it in print. In the True Law of Free Monarchies, and in the Book of Counsel he wrote for his own sons, the Basilican Doron, and defended it before parliaments across 2 reigns. But where James treated the theory with a scholar's fluidity, deploying it and then bending when bending was wise, Charles held it with a rigid and unyielding intensity. Shaped by the silences of his boyhood and the discipline of his own long self-command, he was constitutionally incapable of the quiet compromises and back-channel bargains that oil the machinery of government. To Charles there was only the right, which was his, and the wrong, which was the obstruction of men who did not grasp the nature of monarchy. The collision came almost the moment he took the throne. When he summoned his first parliament in 1625, he expected, as a matter of course, the grant of tonnage and poundage, the customs duties that were the crown's essential revenue, to be voted to him for life, as it had been to his predecessors for generations. Instead, the Commons, uneasy at his policies and at the towering influence of Buckingham, granted the duties for a single year only. It was an unprecedented limitation, and Charles read it not as a debate over finance, but as a calculated personal insult, a refusal to trust him with the government of his own kingdom. The seed of a lifelong distrust of parliaments was planted in that first frosty session, and it never stopped growing, When the Lords let the bill lapse rather than pass so pointed a rebuke, Charles was left with no lawful grant at all, and went on levying the duties at every port regardless, so that the customs money on which his government ran was now to his critics itself unlawful. With the treasury empty and the king unwilling to bargain, the crown fell back on the only authority it fully recognized, the direct command of the monarch. The war with Spain that Charles had pressed for, and now pursued with a desperate and unearned confidence, devoured money, and when Parliament would not vote it, he began to raise forced loans, summoning men of means and commanding them to pay under the shadow of royal displeasure. To the landed gentry and the merchants it felt like the death of the rule of law. When 5 gentlemen refused the loan, they were imprisoned without charge, and their challenge in the courts, the 5 Knights case of 1627, brought the whole question to a head. Could a king take a subject's money and lock away his person at his own pleasure and without cause shown? If he could, then the ancient liberties of the English subject were no liberties at all, but privileges held at the royal whim. The crisis was worsened beyond repair by the military record of the man Charles loved best. Buckingham, for all his charm, proved almost wholly incompetent in the field. In 1625 he set in train an expedition against the Spanish port of Cadiz. It collapsed into a drunken, disorganized shambles that humiliated England before all of Europe. 2 years later he led a fleet to the Ile de Ré to relieve the Protestant Huguenots besieged at La Rochelle, a venture that contrived to put England at war with France while it was already at war with Spain. And it ended in another disaster. The English soldiers cut down in a desperate scramble back to their boats, while La Rochelle itself was left to fall to the armies of the French crown. Each of the favourites' failures was, in the public eye, a failure of the king, who shielded him. When Parliament, with the fierce Cornish orator Sir John Eliot foremost among its voices, moved to impeach the Duke as the author of every national misfortune, Charles dissolved it to save him, and had Eliot and a colleague briefly clapped in the Tower for their pains, emerging only more isolated and more desperate for funds than before. By 1628, the mood in London had turned combustible, and the king, out of money for his wars, was forced to summon Parliament yet again. This time the members, led by lawyers and country gentlemen deeply versed in the history of their own rights, among them the aged and formidable jurist Sir Edward Coke, came armed with a document. The Petition of Right was formal, measured, and devastating. It held that no man should be taxed without the consent of Parliament, that none should be imprisoned without cause shown, that martial law should not be imposed in time of peace, and that soldiers should not be billeted by force upon private households. It was the gravest challenge to royal power in living memory. Cornered by his need for money, Charles gave his assent in June 1628, allowing the ancient words of agreement to be pronounced. But he gave it with a private reservation that would poison the peace of the realm. He did not accept that the petition could bind his prerogative, and he meant to treat it as a set of suggestions rather than a binding law. Then the tension broke in an act of violence that shattered the king's world. On the 23rd of August, 1628, Buckingham was at Portsmouth mustering another expedition for the relief of La Rochelle. As he passed through a corridor of the house where he lodged, a naval officer named John Felton, a man passed over for promotion, owed his back pay, and brooding on the parliamentary declaration that had branded the Duke a public grievance, stepped forward and drove a knife into him. Buckingham fell within moments. Felton made no attempt to escape. He was tried and hanged that November, and went to the gallows believing he had rid the nation of a tyrant. The news sent a shudder through the country, and it exposed in a single stroke the gulf between the king and his people. While Charles shut himself away in his private chambers and wept a grief he made no effort to hide, the streets of London filled with an ugly, spontaneous rejoicing. Men lit bonfires and drank the health of the assassin, and Felton was hailed as a deliverer. Charles, alone with his sorrow, saw only the malice of his subjects, a parliament that had hounded his dearest friend into the grave, and a public that cheered a murderer. The boy who had once been the spare, schooled to bury every feeling behind a mask of regal calm, felt the world go cold around him, and he drew from it a lesson that would govern the next decade. That lesson was sealed in the Parliament that met the following spring. Denied his revenues and lectured on his religion, Charles found the Commons turning now against the Arminian churchmen he favoured, and against the customs duties he was still collecting, without their grant. When he ordered the session of 1629 adjourned, members held the Speaker down in his chair by main force, while, over his protests, they shouted through 3 defiant resolutions condemning illegal taxation and innovation in religion. It was an insult without precedent, the sovereign's own command flouted in his own Parliament House, and it turned a private grief, hardening now into resolve, into a settled policy of rule. The one man Charles had truly loved since boyhood was dead, mourned by almost no one but the king himself. And Charles drew a hard conclusion from the manner of his grief, that Parliament had hounded his friend into the grave, that the members were his enemies, and that he would be better served by ruling without them. In March 1629, he dissolved Parliament in fury and told his councillors he would not call another. He would keep that promise for 11 years, and the silence he imposed would come, in the end, to be called a tyranny. He would govern alone. By the spring of 1629, the king had settled into a resolve that few monarchs in history have ever sustained for long, that the machinery of state could be made to run without the constant grinding friction of an elected assembly. He had spent the first 4 years of his reign locked in a contest with his parliaments over money and the conduct of his wars, and he had come to regard the institution itself not as a partner in government, but as a dangerous and ill-tempered creature bent on shrinking the royal prerogative. With the furious dissolution of that year, the doors of Westminster were locked, and Charles turned his back on the political class of his own realm, for, as it proved, 11 years. For more than a decade, England lived in a silence that was either a golden age of peace or a long, slow descent into despotism, according entirely to who told the story. To the king's admirers, it was the age of thorough, a time of efficient, orderly administration in which the crown lived within its means, and the nation, spared the fractious bickering of the commons, enjoyed a rare stability. To his enemies, it was the 11 years' tyranny, a phrase coined in bitterness by the men who would later break him, describing a decade in which the law was bent to the will of a man who held himself answerable to God alone. Both are arguments dressed as descriptions, and both are partial. The plainer truth lay between them, a king who had mistaken the absence of protest for the presence of consent. To rule without Parliament was to rule without the power to raise new taxes, and in the 17th century that was a perilous way to run a great kingdom. Charles had little choice but to adopt a policy of rigid, sometimes desperate, economy. He brought the ruinous wars with France and Spain to a close, withdrawing England from the bloodshed of the continent. It was a prudent retreat that saved the crown from bankruptcy, and it carried an unlooked-for reward. As a neutral in a Europe at war, England found her merchants prospering as the carriers of other men's trade, and for a great many of the king's subjects the decade was, in bare material terms, a good one. In Ireland, meanwhile, his hard and gifted deputy, Thomas Wentworth, drove a policy he himself named thorough, ruthless, efficient, and profitable, bending that kingdom to the royal will and squeezing from it a revenue England's parliaments would never have voted. Yet peace abroad did not fill the treasury at home, and so the king turned to the deepest and oldest wells of his royal authority to find money that no parliament had granted. He became a master of the archaic. He reached into the dusty cupboards of the medieval law for revenues that had long since fallen out of use. He revived the distraint of knighthood, fining landowners who had failed to present themselves to be knighted at his coronation. He dug out the ancient bounds of the royal forests, generations unenforced, and levied fines on the gentry whose estates were found to lie within them. He sold monopolies on common goods, salt, soap, starch, even the licensing of alehouses, farming out the right to make and sell them to courtiers and syndicates who paid the crown for the privilege and then recouped it with interest from the public. One such grant, handed to a company of Catholic associations, was jeered through the streets as the popish soap. To the king each of these was no more than the diligent gathering of his rightful ancestral dues. To the gentry and the merchants who footed the bill, it felt like a systematic raid upon the property of the subject, and it estranged, one grievance at a time, the very propertied men on whose cooperation any Stuart government finally depended. The Crown's most ingenious and most inflammatory device was the extension of ship money. By ancient custom, the king could require the coastal towns, in an emergency, to furnish ships or the money to build them for the defence of the realm against the sea. In 1634 and 1635, Charles extended the demand to the inland counties as well, arguing that a threat to the coast was a threat to the whole nation. It was a clever stroke of law and a political catastrophe. When the levy was renewed year upon year in the middle of a decade of unbroken peace, and when at its height it was bringing in sums approaching £200,000 a year, it became plain to every man of sense that this was no occasional war measure for a fleet, but a permanent annual tax imposed on the whole of England without the consent of its representatives. The resentment simmered until it found a voice in John Hampden. A Buckinghamshire gentleman of standing and sobriety, Hampden refused to pay the few shillings assessed on his land, not as a firebrand, but as a landowner who held that the Crown could not take a subject's property without the sanction of Parliament. His case was argued through 1637 and into 1638 before all 12 judges of the realm, and it forced them to choose between the ancient absolute claims of the Crown and the evolving liberties of the subject. They found for the king, but by the narrowest of margins, a split most often given as 7-5. It was a legal victory and a moral defeat. That so many of his own judges had doubted him told the nation that the royal prerogative was no longer the bedrock of the law, but a contested claim that reasonable men might resist. The king had won his tax and lost his aura of unquestioned right. Across the shires, men who had paid without a murmur in 1635 began quietly to withhold, and the yield of ship money fell away year on year as the decade wore toward its close. Behind these account books and legal battles, meanwhile, there flourished another world entirely. Away from the grumbling of the shires and the cold light of the courtroom, Charles was cultivating a realm of extraordinary beauty. He was, beyond dispute, the greatest collector ever to hold the English throne, a man whose eye for a picture was as sure as his grasp of his own subjects was faint. In 1632 he drew the Flemish master Anthony Van Dyck to London and made him his principal painter, and through Van Dyck's brush he projected a monarchy that was cool, elegant, and perfectly composed, himself made tall and effortless on horseback, armoured and colossal beneath a great arch, or turned upon a single canvas into 3 positions at once, his family gathered about him in luminous calm. Around these he ranged his Titians and his Raphaels and his Holbeins, filling the galleries of Whitehall and Somerset House with a hoard that would swell to well over 1,000 pictures, a collection that was the envy of every prince in Europe. He loved the theatre of his court above all. The elaborate masques staged by the architect Inigo Jones, in which he and Henrietta Maria appeared amid painted clouds and moving scenery, dancing through allegories of harmony, where the king figured not as a politician, but as a serene and ordering light. He was a man of exquisite taste, alive to the hanging of a canvas and the proportion of a room, genuinely persuaded that the splendour of his court was the outward image of the order he was bringing to his people. He did not perceive that his passion for the appearance of order was blinding him to the substance of his subjects' discontent, that every time he squeezed a merchant's purse or bent the law to secure his prerogative, he laid another brick in the wall that would one day close around him. He was, of all the men in England, the most refined and the most alone, a sincere and private soul, a husband who loved his wife past reason, and a father who looked on his children as the future of a dynasty he believed ordained by God, ruling a kingdom he could no longer hear. On the surface, England had never looked more serene, a king at peace, a court of unrivalled splendour, walls hung with the finest pictures in the world. But the calm was a held breath. The money he raised without consent had taught his subjects to see a tyrant behind the connoisseur, and the peace depended on one condition only, that he never need a parliament again. Then from the cold country of his birth came the one thing that could shatter it. Charles decided that the Scots, too, should pray as he did. The peace of the Middle Years was not a static thing, it was a crusade. If Charles saw his government as a work of art, he saw his church as the soul of that art, and he was determined that it should be as dignified, as orderly, and as structured as the collections he amassed in his galleries. To the king, the state of the Church of England was a source of profound and intimate distress. He looked upon the parish churches of his realm and saw not the glory of God, but a cluttered, neglected, and disorderly landscape where the sacred had been dragged down to the level of the mundane. His was a particular vision of worship, one the age would come to call Arminian, a theology that softened the harsh Calvinist emphasis on predestination and the elect, and set in its place the dignity of the sacraments, the authority of the bishops, and the beauty of a church that lifted the eye toward heaven. It was a minority taste in England, and a provoking one, for it ran against the grain of 3 generations of plainer, sterner Protestant feeling. He found his partner in this vision in William Laud, a man who shared the king's obsession with structure and his profound dislike for the chaotic, sermon-heavy enthusiasm of the Puritan movement. Laud was small, energetic, and tireless, an authoritarian by temperament, who pursued conformity with the zeal of a man who believed that the smallest disorder in a chancel was an insult to God. In 1633, Charles elevated him to the Archbishopric of Canterbury, and the 2 men began a systematic transformation of English worship. They called it the beauty of holiness. To a modern eye, it was a program of aesthetic restoration. To the 17th century observer, it was a revolution. The centerpiece of the Laudian reform was the communion table. In the plain, stripped-back churches of the English Reformation, this table was often placed in the middle of the chancel, a wooden board where a congregation might sit or gather as they would at a common meal. Laud and Charles demanded that it be moved to the east end of the church, set against the wall like an altar, and protected by a rail before which the faithful were to kneel. The clergy were to wear their traditional vestments The ritual was to be precise and uniform, and the congregation was expected to bow at the name of Jesus. These were, in the minds of the king and the archbishop, acts of reverence owed to the divine, gestures meant to remind the people that they stood in the presence of something larger and older than themselves, a kingdom of order that began with God and flowed downward to the crown. But they had fundamentally misjudged the temper of the people they led. England was a nation that had lived for 3 generations with the memory of the Marian persecutions and the existential dread of the Spanish Armada. To a large part of the population, the sight of an altar rail and the insistence on ritual were not merely decorative, they were the unmistakable markers of popery. These were not fools or fanatics, but sober men and women who had been taught from the cradle that the Roman Church was a corrupt and idolatrous machinery of tyranny. When they looked at the king's reforms, they did not see a return to beauty. They saw old Catholic wine poured quietly into Protestant bottles, and behind it the slow, deliberate outline of a road that led back to Rome. This fear was sharpened by the presence of Henrietta Maria. The Queen's Chapel at Somerset House was a sanctuary for Catholicism in the heart of London, with an open, active priesthood and the visible pageantry of the Mass. For the anxious Protestant, the connection was inescapable. The king's wife was a Catholic who worshipped freely. The king's archbishop was pushing the national church toward Catholic ritual, and the king himself was using the machinery of the state to crush anyone who dared to say so aloud. The suspicion was unjust. Charles was no secret papist, and Laud was so far from Rome that when the offer of a cardinal's hat was quietly put to him, he refused it flatly. But suspicion does not answer to fairness, and it grew by the year. The machinery of that repression was the most chilling aspect of the decade. Charles and Laud did not rely on the ordinary courts of law, where juries might prove sympathetic to the accused. Instead, they wielded the prerogative courts, the Star Chamber and the Court of High Commission. These were instruments of the royal will operating outside the common law, where judges could impose savage punishments without a trial by peers and without appeal. The most infamous application of this power came in 1637, when the Star Chamber brought 3 men to the dock: William Prynne, a lawyer, Henry Burton, a minister, and John Bastwick, a physician. They had written with uncompromising fury against the bishops and the liturgical changes, branding the hierarchy as agents of an anti-Christian corruption. For Prynne, it was a second offence. 3 years earlier, in 1634, he had already been condemned for his enormous tract Histriomastics, an attack upon the stage and the pastimes of the court. Now the 3 were sentenced together, and the answer of the state was not argument but mutilation. They were to be pilloried in public and to have their ears cropped, and Prynne, the twice condemned, was to be branded upon the cheeks with the letters S and L for schismatic libeller. It was a sentence intended to shame the men, to render them grotesque and unmentionable. Instead, the brutality of it turned them into folk heroes. A great crowd gathered to witness the spectacle, not to mock the condemned, but to press close, to offer them comfort, to catch their words, and to carry the memory of their defiance out of London and into the country. The king's justice, meant to demonstrate the absolute authority of the crown, had succeeded only in demonstrating its cruelty. By turning critics into martyrs, Charles and Laud were not silencing the opposition. They were handing it a voice that could not be ignored. The tragedy lay in the blindness of the reformers. Charles was not a secret Catholic, nor was he trying to sell England to the Pope. He was a man of deep, sincere, and perhaps narrow Protestant conviction, who believed that if he could only make the exterior of the church look as he imagined it should, the inner devotion of his people would follow. He felt a genuine, pious responsibility for their souls, and he believed that he was performing a righteous duty by imposing a uniform, dignified order upon them. He could not or would not understand that for many of his subjects the shape of worship was not a matter of decoration, but the very ground of their identity, the one thing they would defend past reason and past safety. The enforcement of that uniformity became a trial of strength that the king was determined to win. He and Laud believed that once the people were made to obey, they would in time learn to love the wisdom of their masters, and so they sealed every vent of dissent and demanded that the whole weight of the state be brought down to hold the lid in place. In doing so, they made the king the face of every grievance at once: the money taken for the navy without consent, the forest fines and the farmed-out monopolies, the bishop's rules, the heavy hand of the Star Chamber, until every local irritation had become a direct quarrel with the crown itself. Around Charles, the court hardened into an echo chamber of his own convictions, a circle of men who read the murmuring of the people not as a warning, but as a sickness that called for stronger medicine. There was a profound, quiet certainty in all of this, a sense that the king and the archbishop were the only two men in the kingdom who truly grasped the divine architecture of the state. And so, having remade the Church of England in the image of order, they turned their eyes north. They were about to take the most volatile ingredient in the whole of their English reforms, the prayer book, and press it upon a nation that had spent 100 years defining its faith against the very things the king now championed. Charles believed, to the depth of his soul, that a well-ordered church was the mirror of a well-ordered kingdom, and that God would bless a people who worshipped him with beauty and obedience. He could not conceive that reverence might feel, to a plain Protestant in a plain church, like the first step of a long road back to Rome. In the summer of 1637, he resolved to bring that beauty to Scotland, and to place his English prayer book in the hands of a nation that had not asked for it. On the 23rd of July, in the High Kirk of St. Giles in Edinburgh, a woman named Jenny Geddes is said to have picked up her stool. The book itself was a beautiful thing, printed on the royal presses in clean and elegant type, bound to carry a single form of worship into every corner of the king's 3 kingdoms. To Charles, it was an act of grace rather than an imposition. He could see no reason why the Kirk of Scotland, the land of his own birth, should pray in a manner different from the Church of England. But Scotland was not England. It had made its reformation in a harder, plainer, more thoroughgoing key than the South, governing its kirk by ministers and elders rather than by bishops, and it guarded that inheritance with a jealous and unbending pride. Charles either did not grasp this or did not care to. He had prepared the ground for years, and in the summer of 1637 he judged that the moment had come. On the 23rd of July, in the High Kirk of St. Giles in Edinburgh, the dean climbed into the pulpit, opened the new prayer book, and began to read. The reaction was instantaneous. History, always fond of a single vivid hero, has fastened upon the name of Jenny Geddes, a market woman who is said to have snatched up the folding stool she sat on and hurled it at the dean's head, crying out that he would not say the Mass in her ear. Whether any woman of that name truly threw the first stool is a matter of stubborn folklore. The story cannot be verified, and it appears in no account written on the day. What cannot be doubted is the explosion that followed. The congregation, far from being awed by the beauty of the new rite, drowned it beneath a roar of fury. Stools and Bibles and curses flew through the ancient church, and the tumult spilled out of St. Giles and into the streets, a wildfire the magistrates of Edinburgh were powerless to put out. The disorder did not stay in one city either. In the king's prayer book the people had seen a Trojan horse, and inside it, unmistakably to their eyes, the shape of Rome, Charles received the reports in London with a cold and mounting disbelief, reading the disorder not as a failure of his policy, but as a moral failure in his subjects. He had offered them, as he saw it, the dignity of a common faith, and they had answered with the vulgarity of a mob. But the Scots were not merely rioting, they were organising. In February of 1638, in the churchyard of Greyfriars Kirk in Edinburgh, the movement found both its voice and its structure in a document called the National Covenant. It was an oath of terrible, disciplined unity, subscribed by nobles and lairds, ministers and ploughmen alike, binding the whole nation together to defend its Presbyterian kirk against the innovations of the Crown. Copies were carried the length of the country for men to set their hands to, and thousands did. It was at once a religious vow and a political compact, welding the faith of the kirk to the pride of the nation into a single, immovable cause. For the first time in his life, Charles faced not a troublesome faction, but an entire people arrayed against him, a wall of national will that no royal command could simply order to disperse. To yield to that will was, in his eyes, unthinkable. It would mean conceding that a king might be dictated to by his own subjects in the one sphere, the worship of God, where he held his authority to be most sacred of all. And so a religious quarrel hardened, almost of its own weight, into a military one. The Scots did not flinch from the prospect. They gathered arms, drilled their levies, and made ready to defend their kirk with the sword should the king bring one north. What had begun with a stool flung in a cathedral was becoming, month by month, a war between the king and the oldest of his three kingdoms. The king's answer was a ruinous blend of half-hearted force and stubborn miscalculation. He convinced himself that a show of arms would frighten the Scots back into their habitual deference, and in 1639 he marched north to lead an army in person in what would be remembered as the First Bishops' War. It was a humiliation from the outset. His men were raw, ill-paid, and deeply reluctant to fight fellow Protestants over the shape of a service book, while the Covenanting army drawn up against them had been stiffened by hard professional soldiers lately come home from the wars in Germany, men who knew their trade. Charles reached the border, looked across at a force better disciplined and far more willing than his own, and had no stomach for the slaughter, nor the money to sustain a long campaign if he had wanted one. In June 1639 he agreed to the pacification of Berwick, a truce that settled nothing at all. The Scots kept their covenant, the king kept his resentment, and both sides went home knowing the quarrel had only been postponed. He returned to London with an empty treasury and a wounded pride. For 11 years he had governed without a parliament, scraping revenue from ship money, forest fines, and the sale of monopolies. But the cost of a real army lay far beyond such piecemeal shifts, and at last he was forced to do the thing he had sworn he never would. In April 1640 he summoned a parliament, trusting that the danger from the north would frighten the members into voting his subsidies without delay. It was a grave misjudgment. The men who assembled at Westminster on the 13th of April had not come to fund a war against their fellow subjects. They had come to demand a reckoning for the 11 years they regarded as a tyranny. Led by John Pym, they refused to speak of the king's money until they had first aired the grievances of the kingdom, the unlawful taxes, the religious innovations, the long setting aside of the ordinary law. Every day that Charles waited for his supply, the members spent instead upon the wrongs of the decade. He had come to them as a man comes to a bank, expecting his money upon demand. They treated his emergency as their long-awaited opportunity, and would grant him nothing until he first gave ground. For 3 weeks the deadlock held, and on the 5th of May, having gained not a penny, he dissolved them in anger. It had lasted barely 3 weeks, and history would name it the Short Parliament. Its collapse left him worse off than before, with a war to fight and no lawful means to pay for it. He scraped after money by every desperate expedient, and still it came nowhere near enough. When the Second Bishops' War arrived in the late summer of 1640, it was a disaster without qualification. This time the Scots did not wait behind their border. They crossed it, and they came in strength. On the 28th of August at Newburn-on-the-Tyne, their army broke the English troops set to guard the river crossing and sent them reeling in a rout. Newcastle fell, and with it the great coal trade on which London depended for its winter fires. The Scots settled into the northern counties and refused to withdraw until their costs were met, and by the Treaty of Ripon that October, Charles was reduced to paying his invaders £850 a day to remain unmolested upon English soil. A foreign army quartered on his own kingdom at his own expense, and every day its stayed drained a treasury he did not have. He was trapped, and the trap was of his own devising. The king who had proclaimed his right to govern by the sole grace of God now sat a supplicant to his own rebellious subjects, paying out coin by the day to keep a hostile army from marching on his capital. The myth of his invincibility had dissolved in the northern reign. He had gambled the authority of the crown upon a single, avoidable war over the shape of a prayer, and he had lost the wager entirely. Every prerogative device of the personal rule had been spent, and every one of them had failed him. He had gone to war to make one island pray with one voice, and he had lost, beaten in the field by the poorest of his 3 kingdoms, and forced to bribe a foreign army to sit on English soil. The treasury was empty, the north was occupied, and every prerogative trick of the last 11 years had run out. There was only one door left, and it was the one he had bolted shut in a rage in 1629. In November 1640, Charles opened it. The Parliament that walked through would still be sitting when the axe fell, and its first act would be to come for the 2 men the king loved best. No other choice remained. In November of 1640, the king, who had ruled for 11 years without a parliament, was forced to summon one to pay for his failure in the north, and on the 3rd of that month the assembly history would call the Long Parliament took its seats. The men who gathered at Westminster were not the pliant courtiers of an easier age. They were the landed gentry and the common lawyers who had watched their estates squeezed by ship money, and their consciences pressed by the reach of the High Commission, and they came carrying the accumulated grievance of a decade. At their head stood John Pym, a deliberate, cold-eyed manager of men, and under his direction the Parliament moved with a speed that left the court reeling. They did not merely petition for reform, they took the machinery of the personal rule apart piece by piece. They declared ship money illegal, condemning at a stroke the levy that had done more than any other to turn the gentry against the crown. They abolished the Star Chamber and the Court of High Commission, the 2 prerogative tribunals through which the king and Laud had disciplined their critics without a jury. And they passed the Triennial Act, which required that a parliament be summoned at least once in every 3 years, whether the king willed it or not, a direct assault on the very silence Charles had imposed after 1629. The same reckoning had already swept up Archbishop Laud himself, impeached and shut in the Tower to await a trial of his own. By the spring of 1641, the authority of the crown had been quietly, methodically hollowed out. But to Pym and his allies these victories were only the beginning, for they knew that so long as the king kept his strongest servant at his side, nothing they had built was safe. That servant was Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford. He had been the King's Lord Deputy in Ireland, a man of terrifying competence who had governed that kingdom with an iron hand, and he was feared above all others as the one minister with the will and the skill to make Charles truly absolute. To the opposition he was the living embodiment of everything they had risen against, the counsellor who had urged the king to be firm, the man who, if given the chance, would surely turn a standing army upon the Parliament that defied him. He was, moreover, the one figure at court with the cold intelligence to fight Pym on his own ground and win. And so, in the pitiless logic of the moment, he had to be destroyed. To strike down Strafford was to strike the sword from the king's own hand. The impeachment for high treason opened in the spring of 1641, a vast public spectacle staged in Westminster Hall, where the peers sat as his judges and the Commons crowded in to hear the charges read against the fallen viceroy. Charles himself came to watch day after day from a curtained gallery above the hall. But as the weeks of testimony wore on, the case began to come apart. Strafford defended himself with a brilliance that astonished his accusers, dismantling each article in turn and showing, with formidable command of the law, that nothing he had done amounted to the specific crime of treason against the king's person. Treason was the betrayal of the sovereign, and Strafford's whole life had been service to him. The charge would not hold. Seeing a conviction slip through their fingers, the Parliament reached for a blunter instrument, the Act of Attainder. This was not a trial, but a legislative sentence of death. A bill that required no proof of any particular crime, only a majority in both houses and the assent of the king to become law. It was a device that laid the whole weight of the decision upon Charles himself, for it could not kill Strafford without the signature of the very master Strafford had served. As the bill passed through the Commons and then the Lords, London rose about the palace. Great crowds pressed at the gates of Whitehall day and night, their voices climbing in a steady roar for justice, by which they meant the blood of the man they held to be the author of their oppression. Names of those thought friendly to Strafford were posted up as enemies of the kingdom. Rumours ran that the mob would force the gates of Whitehall itself, and the safety of the Queen seemed to hang upon what the king would decide. Inside the palace, Charles weighed the lives of his wife and children against the life of his friend. He was caught in a trap he had helped to build. He had given Strafford his solemn written word that his minister should not suffer in life, honour, or fortune, and had pledged the whole power of the crown to shield him. Now that power was gone, voted away article by article, and the promise was worth no more than the king's ability to keep it. Within the Tower of London, Strafford followed the progress of the attainder with a composure that unsettled those around him. He was a servant of the old school who held that a subject's loyalty to his prince was the first of all duties, and when he grasped that the struggle over his single life was dragging the king toward the ruin of his whole government, he did an extraordinary thing. He wrote to Charles and released him from his word. His own life, he told the king, was a small thing to set against the peace of 3 kingdoms, and he begged his master to pass the bill and let him die if his death would quiet the storm. It was the act of a man who loved his sovereign more than his own survival, and it left the decision naked before the king's conscience. For days Charles resisted, turning to his bishops and his judges for any lawful path around it. There was none that the crowds outside would accept. Then, hemmed in on every side, uncertain even of his own guards, and persuaded at last that he could not save both his servant and his family, he broke. On the 10th of May, 1641, he set his hand to the warrant that would take Strafford's life. When word was carried to the Tower that the king had signed, Strafford is reported to have spoken the words of the psalmist, "Put not your trust in princes, nor in the sons of men, for in them there is no salvation," the line preserved for us by contemporaries as the whole measure of his disappointment. 2 days later, on the 12th of May, he was led out to Tower Hill. The crowd that waited there was immense. Observers of the day put it, almost certainly with exaggeration, at something near 100,000 souls, a vast and murmuring sea gathered to watch the fall of the greatest subject in England. Strafford walked to the scaffold with the bearing of a man who had already made his peace, and before the axe fell he spoke, composed to the last. Then it was over. In a single morning the king had lost the one servant strong enough to defend his crown, and had lost him by the stroke of his own pen. The news of the execution ran roaring through the streets of London, but in the king's own heart there was only silence. For the rest of his life, if the royalist writers who knew him are to be believed, Charles counted the signing of that warrant the greatest sin he ever committed, and read into every disaster that followed the just punishment of God for it, an interpretation set down most powerfully by the Earl of Clarendon, writing long afterward and with a royalist case to make, and one best weighed as the testimony of loyal men rather than as certain knowledge of a dead king's soul. Yet whatever passed within him, the men who had forced his hand drew from the affair a colder and more practical lesson. They had watched the king tremble before the clamour of the streets, and they had watched him surrender his most faithful servant the instant the price of loyalty grew too high. It was knowledge they would not forget, and would not scruple to use again. He had signed with a shaking hand, and he never forgave himself for it. Strafford had told him a king's promise was the surest thing in the world, and Charles had broken it to save his own throne, and had not even saved that. For the rest of his life he would carry the conviction that everything which came after was the wage of that one betrayal. But the men now running Parliament had learned something too. They had learned that if they pressed the king hard enough and frightened him badly enough, he would abandon the people who trusted him. And so they pressed harder. The death of the Earl of Strafford had bought Charles nothing. It had removed his ablest servant without winning him a single friend, and it left a vacuum where the strong hand of government had been, a vacuum into which the factions of the Long Parliament poured all their mounting fears. By the late autumn of 1641, the broad agreement that had carried the first reforms was gone. The men who had stood together to break the personal rule now found themselves divided over a deeper question, not how to check the king, but how far to strip him, and whether the cure was not becoming more dangerous than the disease. Some had wanted grievances redressed and the old balance restored. Others meant to remake the constitution of church and state altogether. And as they quarrelled among themselves, something happened that no one had foreseen. For the first time since his accession, Charles began to acquire defenders. The fracture opened around a single document. In November 1641, the king's opponents, led by Pym, laid before the Commons the Grand Remonstrance, a vast and unsparing catalogue of every grievance of the reign, from the forced loans and ship money to the innovations Laud had pressed upon the Church. But it did more than rehearse the past. It demanded that the king should henceforth choose his ministers only with the approval of Parliament, and that the Church be stripped of the bishops and ceremonies he held sacred. This was no longer a plea for the redress of wrongs. It was a claim upon the very substance of royal power, and its boldness alarmed the moderate men of the House, who had wished to bridle the king, not to unmake him. The debate ran long into the night and grew so bitter that men later said the House had come within a breath of drawing swords upon itself. When the vote was at last taken in the small hours of the 22nd of November, 1641, the remonstrance carried by just 159 voices to 148. It was a victory, but a hair's breadth one, and to Charles it carried a message he had never received before. He was no longer a friendless tyrant. He had a party now, and he had a cause. Even as the remonstrance was being fought through the House, the ground gave way beneath the whole kingdom. From Ireland came word of a sudden and massive rising of the Catholic Irish against the Protestant settlers planted among them. The reports that reached London were, in the panicked temper of the age, thick with tales of massacre, of thousands of Protestants slaughtered, driven from their homes, put to the sword. Modern historians are careful to say that these accounts were wildly inflated, swollen by rumour and by the propaganda of men who wished to inflame English feeling, but at the time the terror was total, and it fell upon a nation already primed to fear a popish conspiracy at the very heart of its own court. To a London that dreaded a Catholic plot behind the throne, the rising in Ireland looked like the same conspiracy breaking surface at last. An army would have to be raised to reconquer Ireland. Of that there was no doubt. The question was who would command it, and there the whole crisis came to its unbearable point. For an army is a sword, and neither side would trust the other to hold it. If Parliament granted the taxes to raise the soldiers, the king by ancient right would command them. And the men at Westminster were seized by the fear that Charles, once armed, would turn that force not against the rebels in Ireland, but against his enemies at home. The king, for his part, saw a Parliament that meant to prize the sword of the crown from his grasp, that had hounded his servant to death, and had lately let its mobs threaten the very safety of his queen. Henrietta Maria pressed him hard. She urged him to leave off the endless, fruitless negotiating and to act at last like a king, to seize the initiative, to strike at the men who were dismantling his throne. She saw the parliamentary leaders not as the representatives of his people, but as traitors who had already menaced her person and her faith, and she did not hide her scorn for a husband who bargained where she thought he ought to command. Charles, who had spent a lifetime schooling himself to patience and reserve, at last let that discipline go. He had come to see the leaders of the opposition not as misguided subjects to be won over, but as a knot of conspirators to be cut out, and he persuaded himself that if only the ringleaders were removed, the natural order of the realm would settle back into its proper shape. He resolved upon a single stroke that would end the matter at once. He would go to the House of Commons himself and take the chief of his enemies into custody on a charge of treason. It was a course his boldest counsellors urged and his wisest ones dreaded, and once he had fixed upon it, he would not be turned aside. The flashpoint came on the 4th of January, 1642. Charles set out for Westminster at the head of some hundreds of armed men, soldiers, courtiers, swaggering gentlemen with swords at their hips, and left them at the door as he entered the chamber of the Commons. It was an act without precedent in the history of the kingdom. No monarch had ever set foot in the House of Commons in arms. To cross that threshold with soldiers at his back was to tear away the ancient immunity of the place and to make the seat of law a theatre of force. He had come for 5 men above all: John Pym, John Hampden, Denzil Holles, Arthur Hazelrig, and William Strode, together with a single peer, Lord Mandeville, all of them at the heart of the drive against his authority. Word of his intent, however, had leaked from the court the night before, and so when Charles strode down the aisle and turned to the benches where the 5 men usually sat, he found them empty. Slipping out only minutes before, the members had gone by boat down the river into the shelter of the city. For a moment, the the king stood in the speaker's own place and looked out over the silent, hostile ranks of the house. He asked the speaker, William Lenthal, where the 5 members were, and Lenthal, kneeling, gave the answer that would echo down the centuries, that he had neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in that place, save as the house was pleased to direct him. Charles searched the rows of faces once more, found nothing, and, in words reported by those present, though the exact phrasing varies from one account to another, remarked that he saw all his birds were flown. Then he left the chamber as abruptly as he had come. Behind him he left a house that had just watched its king walk in armed against it, and would never again believe itself safe in his presence. The damage could not be undone. By marching on Parliament in arms and coming away empty-handed, Charles had contrived the worst of every outcome. He had shown himself willing to use force against his own legislature, and he had failed to make it good. Within days, London turned against him utterly. The streets filled with angry crowds. The 5 members, far from being broken, were carried back to Westminster in triumph as the defenders of the nation's liberty, while the trained bands of the city stood to their arms in their defence. The capital that had cheered his coronation now bristled at his approach, and the king found that Whitehall itself was no longer a safe place for him. On the 10th of January 1642, less than a week after his failure in the Commons, Charles quit London and withdrew with his wife and children into the country, meaning to gather his strength and treat with his Parliament from a distance. He would not enter his capital again as its master. He had walked into the House of Commons in arms and found it empty, and in that empty chamber something ancient and irreplaceable had died. No English king had ever done such a thing, and no one now could pretend the old trust survived it. Within the week, the streets of London were shouting for Parliament, and Charles gathered his wife and children and rode out of his own capital into the winter. He would come back to it only once more 7 years later under guard to answer for his life. Between those 2 journeys lay a war that would kill more of his people than any war England had ever fought. The king had fled his capital, but he had not abandoned his crown. By the summer of 1642, the long pretense of governing through consensus had evaporated, replaced by the sharpening of steel and the gathering of levies across every shire. Through those tense months, both sides had raced to arm, each issuing rival commissions to raise men, the king appealing to the ancient loyalties of the gentry, Parliament to its ordinance for the militia, and each scrambling to seize the county magazines, the trained bands, and the arsenals before the other could. Since leaving London in the winter, Charles had drifted north and west through the country, testing where devotion still ran deep. On the 22nd of August, under a sky that seemed to hold its breath, he arrived at Nottingham to raise his royal standard on the castle hill. A herald read the proclamation aloud, the great embroidered banner was hoisted, and every loyal subject was summoned to his sovereign's side in the old, portentous language of medieval war. Yet the heavens themselves seemed to recoil. That first night, a violent gale-force wind tore through the town, snapped the ropes, and cast the heavy pole to the ground, and it was some days before the standard could be securely raised again. To the superstitious, and there were many in that century, it was a dark and unambiguous omen, and the news books, already churning issue with the vitriol of a fracturing nation, made sure the tale was retold in every tavern from Cornwall to the borders. The nation did not divide cleanly. There was no simple geography of loyalty, no neat class-based cleavage that set the king's supporters against his enemies. Allegiance was decided as often by religion, by conscience, and by the settling of old local rivalries as by rank or region, and the result cut through counties, through towns, and through single households alike. Families were torn asunder, with brothers holding commissions on opposing sides and fathers watching sons ride off to a possible fratricide. In the streets and market squares, the names first flung as insults hardened into identities: the Cavaliers, with their long hair and their swagger, loyal to the king's person and the divine order he embodied; and the Roundheads, the parliamentarian men whose close-cropped heads signalled a grim, godly austerity. These were never mere descriptions of fashion. They were the visible signs of two irreconcilable visions for the future of the Church and the State, and men would die in their tens of thousands over the difference. The war began with a shared delusion. Both sides expected a short, sharp shock, a single decisive encounter that would bring the other to its senses and force a return to the table. The king established his wartime capital in the golden, honey-stoned colleges of Oxford, turning the university town into a fortress of royalist culture and administration, while Parliament held the immense beating heart of the nation, London. With the capital went the navy, the customs houses, the ordnance stores, and the vast, untaxed wealth of the southeast. The king's strength lay instead in the north and the west, in the traditional loyalties of the landed gentry and the ancient devotion of men who saw the crown as the one bulwark against anarchy. But as the autumn leaves began to fall, the conflict shifted from the abstract to the visceral, and the fantasy of a bloodless settlement died with the season. On the 23rd of October, 1642, the two armies collided at last on the rolling slopes of Edgehill in Warwickshire. It was the first true testing of the nation's blood, and both hosts were largely raw, apprentices and ploughmen and country gentlemen who had never before stood in a line of battle, drawn up with the pike and musket in the continental fashion, and asked to use them upon their neighbours. The fighting was chaotic, brutal, and profoundly inconclusive. The king's nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, the son of Charles's sister Elizabeth, a young man who had already learned his soldiering in the merciless wars of the continent, led the royalist cavalry in a thunderous charge that shattered the parliamentary horse on the left. But, in his impetuousness, Rupert let his troopers ride on, plundering and pursuing the fleeing enemy far beyond the field, and left the king's infantry exposed as the parliamentary foot recovered and pressed back. When the early dark came down, the ground was choked with the dead and the dying, and neither side could honestly claim the victory. It was a bitter foretaste of everything to come, valour without result, and a butcher's reckoning at the end of it. In the weeks after Edgehill, the road to London lay briefly open. For a moment the king had his chance to march on his capital, overawe the rebellion, and perhaps end the struggle at a stroke. But Charles, ever the deliberator, hesitated, moving with a caution that maddened his bolder commanders. By the time the royal army reached Turnham Green on the 13th of November, the citizens of London had mobilized in their thousands. The trained bands, the militia of the capital, drawn up shoulder to shoulder with the parliamentary field army, stood in solid, grim ranks across the road. The king looked upon that wall of men, weighed the cost of forcing his way through his own subjects, and chose instead to fall back to Oxford. It was a decision that may well have cost him the war. He had traded a single desperate gamble for a long grind of sieges and marches that would consume years, and the quick war both sides had wanted became the very thing they had least imagined. As months turned into years, the conflict bled into every corner of the three kingdoms, and its human texture darkened beyond anything the island had known. The war settled into a pattern of siege and skirmish, of regions banding into associations for their own defence, and towns walling themselves against neighbours who had lately been friends. Henrietta Maria, braved the winter seas to the continent and back, pawning the crown jewels and running shiploads of powder and arms to her husband's cause. And in Ireland the fighting spiralled into a catastrophe of famine, disease, and sectarian slaughter on a scale that would scar the land for generations. Modern historians, surveying the wreckage of the whole period, have suggested that the dead across England, Scotland, and Ireland amounted to a proportion of the population greater than the share the United Kingdom would lose in the First World War, a figure that is necessarily an estimate, and that fell most cruelly of all upon Ireland. This was no war of gentlemen's rules, it was a war of scorched earth and burned villages, of plundered farms and soldiers billeted at free quarter upon households that could not refuse them, of Englishmen killing Englishmen. And everywhere it passed, it emptied the barns, pressed the ploughmen into the ranks, and left the ordinary people to pay in blood and grain for a quarrel their betters had begun. It was managed on the royal side by a king who tried to direct a sprawling, fracturing enterprise from a court that grew grander and more desperate by the month. By 1643, the royalist cause reached its high tide. The armies of the north and the west carried much before them through that year, and in the summer Prince Rupert stormed Bristol, the kingdom's second port, so that for a season it seemed the rebellion might yet be broken, and the king ride back into London in triumph. Charles remained the still centre of a glittering, straitened court, attending to his generals and his pictures alike, clinging to the conviction that his cause was just in the sight of God. What he could not see was the transformation quietly underway in the camps of his enemies. Parliament was learning. In the eastern counties, where its hold was firmest, its scattered forces were beginning to knit together into something disciplined and durable, an army that would owe nothing to the seasonal loyalties of the gentry and everything to professional rigour and burning conviction. And one obscure member of Parliament, drilling his troop of horse in that quiet corner of the country, was already teaching such an army how to ride. The armies had marched out that first summer, almost as if to a tournament, sure the whole business would be settled by Christmas with a single honest battle. It was not settled by Christmas, nor for years of Christmases after. Town by town and field by field, Englishmen learned to kill Englishmen, and the dead were counted in numbers this island had never known. And while the king held his glittering little court at Oxford, and his cavalry won its dashing victories, far off in the eastern counties an obscure and middle-aged member of Parliament was drilling a troop of horse and beginning to think that God had chosen him for something. The war that had begun as a series of skirmishes between gentlemen had, by 1643, mutated into a slow-burning catastrophe for the English people. The king's soldiers had held their ground through the first clashes and even carried the royalist cause to its high water mark, but the sheer arithmetic of the conflict was beginning to shift against them. Parliament, recognizing that its local militias were no match for the professional ardour of the royalist horse, looked north for allies. It turned to the Scots, the king's own countrymen, already nursing bitter grievances against the crown over the prayer book and the bishops. In the autumn of 1643, the two sides struck a bargain and sealed it in the Solemn League and Covenant, in exchange for a solemn promise that Parliament would reform the English Church along Presbyterian lines, a prospect that chilled Charles to the core, for it struck at the very order of worship he held sacred. The Scots agreed to send a great seasoned army across the border. By January of 1644, that host of many thousands was marching into northern England, and its weight began to press the royalist cause into a corner from which it would never climb free. The breaking point came on a warm evening in July of 1644 at Marston Moor, a stretch of open moorland outside York. Prince Rupert had marched hard to relieve the besieged city, and when the two great hosts drew up facing one another across the rain-soaked ground, they made the largest battle ever fought on English soil, a collision of tens of thousands of men in the long northern twilight. For a time, the outcome hung in the balance, but the tide turned on the discipline of the parliamentary cavalry. A middle-aged member of Parliament named Oliver Cromwell, commanding the horse of the Eastern Association, had spent the previous year training his troopers to a standard of drill and religious zeal that few royalist commanders could match. They were the Ironsides, men who charged with the terrifying conviction that they did the work of God, and who did not scatter to plunder but wheeled and reformed and struck again. As the evening wore on, they crashed into the royalist lines and broke them. Prince Rupert, the king's brilliant and volatile nephew, watched his northern army disintegrate in the dusk, and with it the aura of invincibility that had clung to his name since the war's first summer. By the time the moon rose over the moor, the whole north of England was lost to the king. Marston Moor was a symptom of a deeper rot in the royalist machinery. While the king's forces still depended on the shifting loyalties of local gentry and the dwindling resources of his court, Parliament set about forging a new kind of weapon. In the early months of 1645, it passed the Self-Denying Ordinance, stripping its aristocratic commanders of their commands at a stroke, and reorganized its scattered regiments into a single national force, the new model army. This was something without precedent in English warfare. A standing army centrally funded and regularly paid, its officers advanced for merit and zeal rather than for birth or acreage, its ranks clothed alike in coats of red and welded together by a fierce, uncompromising Puritan faith. At its head stood Sir Thomas Fairfax as Captain General, a brave and modest soldier, with Cromwell as his Lieutenant General of Horse. In its ranks, a plain man might rise to a command by force of courage and conviction alone, and its regiments went into battle singing psalms, a spectacle that struck the king's cavaliers as at once absurd and deeply unsettling. It was not merely a collection of soldiers, it was a crusade with a pay-chest, and it would prove the most formidable army the islands had ever raised. The test of this new instrument came on the 14th of June, 1645, at Naseby, in the rolling country of the Midlands. It was here that the king staked everything on a single field. His army, outnumbered and outmanoeuvred, was caught on the high ground by the new model army, and the fighting, though fierce, was soon decided. Rupert's cavalry charged, and as at Edgehill, chased their beaten foes clean off the field, but Cromwell's horse held to their discipline, turned upon the exposed royalist foot, and rolled it up. The king's infantry was overwhelmed, its formations crumpling under the relentless pressure, and by the end of the day the king's principal field army had simply ceased to exist. Charles himself barely escaped, riding from the wreck and leaving behind his baggage train, his treasure, and, fatally, his private papers. It was in those abandoned cabinets that the king lost far more than a battle. When the victors pried open his correspondence, they found more than plans of campaign. They found the receipts of his secret diplomacy, proof that he had been treating with Irish Catholic leaders to bring their troops into England against his own subjects, and pleading with foreign monarchs to send armies into his realm. The parliamentary press moved with lethal efficiency, printing the papers under the title, "The King's Cabinet Opened." The effect was seismic. To the ordinary Englishman who had been assured that Charles was the defender of the faith and the father of his people, the letters revealed a man willing to set his own kingdom ablaze to preserve his throne. Here, in his own hand, was the very charge his enemies had always flung at him, and he had always denied, that he would sooner rule a ruined, foreign-garrisoned England than reign as a limited king over a free one. From that day forward, the king's word, the promise of an anointed sovereign, once thought the surest thing on earth, was understood by his enemies to be a snare, and every future negotiation would be conducted in the long shadow of what those letters had shown. The collapse that followed was agonizingly slow. Through the rest of 1645 and into the spring of 1646, the new model army marched almost at will through a country that had lost the strength to resist it, and the great fortress towns of the western north opened their gates one after another, their garrisons too few, too hungry, and too dispirited to hold. Charles rode from one shrinking stronghold to the next, in search of a field army that no longer existed, until he was left with nothing but his own person and a handful of loyal servants. He was a king without a kingdom, a general without an army, and a negotiator whose signature was now read as a trap. The guilt that had shadowed him since he signed Strafford's warrant seemed to harden into a cold finality. He had sworn to protect his subjects and had invited foreign soldiers to occupy their towns. He had sworn to rule by law and had turned his back on his own parliaments, and every broken oath had come home to roost at once. In May of 1646, his options finally exhausted, the king made his last free move. For days he had wavered over where to turn, to the Scots, to the shattered royalists of Ireland, to the French coast and his queen in exile, before settling upon the countrymen of his birth as the likeliest of his enemies to be won over. He slipped out of the besieged city of Oxford in disguise, his hair and beard cut close, and rode north to give himself up to the Scottish army encamped before Newark. Even in ruin he believed he could play the Scots against the English Parliament, stir jealousy among his victorious enemies, and negotiate his way back onto the throne. The Scots, for their part, held him for months, while they pressed both king and Parliament for terms, and at length, upon a great payment of the arrears owed to their army, delivered him to the English commissioners and marched home, a transaction his supporters would forever brand as the selling of a king, though the Scots insisted it was only the settling of a lawful debt. However it was named, the meaning was plain. The first civil war was over. The anointed sovereign of three kingdoms was a prisoner passed from hand to hand, and everyone now wondered what on earth was to be done with him. The letters undid him more surely than any battle. In his own careful hand, printed now for every literate subject to read, was the proof that he had schemed to bring Irish Catholic soldiers and foreign armies against his English people. And after that, no promise he made could ever again be believed. He had lost his army, his cause, and the one thing a king in defeat most needs, which is to be trusted. In the spring of 1646, he gave himself up, still certain he could play his three enemies against one another and rise from the ruin. It was the most dangerous illusion of his life, and it would take him step by step to a scaffold. The collapse of the royalist cause did not end the war, it merely dissolved the unity of the victors. When the Scots handed Charles to the parliamentary commissioners in the opening weeks of 1647, they were not so much surrendering a prisoner as shedding a liability. The king was a prize that none of the three kingdoms could safely keep, yet none could afford to lose. He remained the single, indispensable source of legal authority, the only man whose signature could give a settlement the force of law. To the Presbyterians who dominated Parliament, he was a necessary tool for restoring the old order under a stricter religious roof. To the new model army he was something far more dangerous, a man who had already shown himself an incorrigible architect of ruin. The army was not a monolith, but it had become a brotherhood defined by its own blood sacrifice. These were men who had stood in the summer storm at Marston Moor and the killing ground at Naseby, and had come to read their victories as a divine verdict. They were soldiers, but they were also preachers, petitioners, and radicals who saw the king's refusal to concede as defiance not merely of Parliament, but of the hand of God. When they seized Charles from Parliament's custody in June 1647, a party of troopers riding to Holdenby under a junior officer, Cornet George Joyce, who bore no warrant but the loaded pistols of his men, the political ground shifted beneath the king's feet. He was no longer the guest of the state, he was the captive of the sword. Charles, for his part, brought to this claustrophobic new reality a dangerous serenity. He watched the mounting friction between Parliament and army with the detachment of a man convinced he held every card that mattered. His enemies' divisions, he believed, were his salvation. So he treated with all of them at once, with the Independents, with the Presbyterians, with the Scottish Commissioners, offering each just enough hope to keep it competing for his favour and binding himself in earnest to none. When the army laid before him the heads of the proposals, a strikingly moderate settlement that would have returned him to the throne under real but survivable limits, he put it aside with a cold, almost regal disdain. He would not, as he saw it, bargain with subordinates. If he simply waited, he reasoned, the soldiers and the members would fall upon one another, and he would be recalled on his own terms. It was a catastrophic misreading. By treating in bad faith, whispering to one faction while publicly negotiating with another, Charles imagined he was displaying the subtle craft of a king. What he was in fact displaying was that no word he gave could be relied upon. His conviction that he answered to God alone meant that any promise extracted from him by mere subjects was, in his own mind, void the instant it left his lips. He carried his duplicity as though it were a burden of his sacred office, a righteous cunning by which an anointed sovereign might outlast a nest of rebels. He did not grasp that those rebels were now watching him with the eyes of men who had buried brothers in his quarrels. In November 1647, the king escaped his loose confinement and fled to the Isle of Wight, hoping to find a refuge from which to engineer a final reversal. Instead, within the stone walls of Carisbrooke Castle, he committed the act that sealed his fate. On the 26th of December, he set his hand to a secret treaty with the Scottish Commissioners. The document history calls the engagement. In return for a Scottish army that would invade England and restore him to his full, unfettered authority, Charles undertook to establish the Presbyterian form of worship across his English kingdom for a trial of 3 years. He had bartered the religion of his own realm for a foreign invasion, negotiating openly for peace in one room while, in the shadows of Carisbrooke, lighting the fuse of a second war. The conflict that came, the Second Civil War, tore through the summer of 1648 with a violence that made the first look almost like a rehearsal. Royalist risings flared in Kent, in Essex, and in Wales, and true to the engagement, a Scottish army crossed the border into the north. But the new model army, hardened by years of grievance over its unpaid wages and led by the tactical certainty of Cromwell and Fairfax, answered with terrifying speed. At Preston in August, the invading Scots were broken and scattered across the Lancashire country. At Colchester, the last royalist garrison was starved through a long and bitter siege into surrender. And when the town at last gave in, 2 of its captured commanders were set against a wall and shot, a cold, deliberate act that measured how far the temper of the victors had turned. The king's hope that his people would rise to deliver him from his captors had produced only a fresh harvest of graves. For the soldiers who had spent that summer suppressing the very rebellion Charles had secretly set in motion, the betrayal was total. They had offered him peace and terms, and he had answered with more war. The language of the camp began to change. Charles was no longer the misled sovereign led astray by evil counsellors. He was the first author of the nation's misery. The men read the casualty lists of the summer's fighting, the young husbands who would not come home, the widows, the charred ruins of English towns, and laid the whole debt at the door of the man in the castle. In their prayer meetings and their petitions they ceased to speak of him as a person led into error, and began to speak of him as a symbol of oaths made only to be broken. The mood in the army had become one of cold, righteous fury. Petitions circulated, drafted by the rank and file and the more radical officers, demanding not further treaty but a reckoning for the blood that had been spilled. The Parliament at Westminster still waited with men who clung to the dream of a limited monarchy, tried to ignore the rising tide. Even after the smoke of the Second Civil War had cleared, they reopened negotiations with the king at Newport. But the army had exhausted its patience with the slow machinery of law. On the 6th of December 1648, the final irrevocable step was taken. Soldiers under Colonel Thomas Pride took up their posts at the doors of the House of Commons and, list in hand, barred and arrested every member known to favour a further treaty with the king. It was a surgical stroke against the political establishment, and it left behind only a compliant remnant, a rump aligned with the army's resolve to bring Charles to account. The members who remained were no longer a parliament in any traditional sense. They were the instrument of the military's will, and their will was now fixed upon a trial. The king, meanwhile, was moved from the relative seclusion of the Isle of Wight to the bleak confinement of Hurst Castle, and then to Windsor, carried ever closer to the centre of power and ever further from any share in the exercise of it. The rump established a high court of justice, a body conjured into being for the sole purpose of trying a monarch for high treason and murder against his own people. The plain legal impossibility of the thing, that a king might be judged by his subjects when all authority was held to descend through him, was simply swept aside by the momentum of the soldiers' resolve. Through it all, Charles remained remarkably composed. He passed his hours in prayer and in reading, his dignity unwavering, his belief in his divine right as impenetrable as ever. He seemed to regard the gathering storm less as the wage of his own broken promises than as a trial of his faith, and he did not appear to understand that the world beyond his window had ceased to believe in the sanctity of his person at all. He had signed a secret treaty to loose a second war upon his people, even as he sat at the negotiating table talking peace, and the soldiers who put it down again came out of the fighting with a single terrible conviction. This king would agree to anything and honour nothing. Every truce he touched became a trap. There could be no safe peace in England while he drew breath. In their prayer meetings they had begun to call him Charles Stuart, that man of blood. In December they purged the Parliament of everyone who still wished to bargain with him. And then the men who had beaten him in the field resolved to do the one thing no subject had ever done to an anointed King of England, to put him on trial for his life. By the turn of the year, the men who had beaten the king had also, at a terrible cost, learned to read him. They had captured his cabinet at Naseby and unpicked the endless back channels of his diplomacy, the letters to the Irish, the whispered bargains with the Scots, the appeals to foreign courts. And they had watched him loose a second war upon the country from a castle where he sat professing his hunger for peace. From all of it they had drawn one flat and unforgiving lesson, that the word of this king was a coin of no value, because in his own mind a promise wrung from him by subjects bound him to nothing at all. He would treat and sign and then repudiate. Each settlement he touched turned in their hands into the seed of fresh bloodshed. And so in their prayer meetings and their petitions, the soldiers had ceased to name him as a sovereign misled, and had begun to name him as a man of blood, to be answered for at last before an earthly bar. On the 20th of January 1649, that conviction was brought to the bar of history. They carried Charles to Westminster Hall, not as a king, but as a prisoner of the state. The hall was a vast and ancient space, fitted out now with tiered benches and barricades to house the High Court of Justice, a tribunal of 135 commissioners named to the task, though on no day would even half of them consent to take their seats. John Bradshaw, a lawyer of grim and unyielding temperament, presided as Lord President, his head shielded beneath a hat lined with plated steel against the pistol shot or the falling stone that many in that charged city thought possible. The air was thick with the dust of centuries and the damp smell of wet wool and nervous breath. When the charge was read, it was a document of revolutionary clarity. It indicted Charles Stuart as a tyrant, a traitor, a murderer, and a public enemy who had wickedly waged war against his own people and sought to overthrow the fundamental laws and liberties of the kingdom. Charles sat in the crimson velvet chair set for him, and as the indictment was read, he did not cower, did not ask for mercy, did not plead. Instead, he regarded his judges with a cold and almost detached curiosity, and when they had finished, he let out a short, dry laugh, the laugh of a man who found the proceeding not merely offensive, but logically absurd. He kept his hat upon his head throughout, a gesture that was less a mark of rank than a refusal to acknowledge that the men before him possessed any authority to be honoured, and when he spoke with a sudden, startling fluency. The stammer that had dogged him since the nursery seemed to fall away, and a clear, deliberate diction cut through the murmur of the hall. He demanded to know by what lawful power he was brought there. Who, he asked, had empowered them to judge a king? A king, he insisted, could not be tried by any superior jurisdiction on earth, for none existed. He was answerable to God alone, and to submit to their sentence would be to betray the trust of the very people in whose name they claimed to act. For 3 days this collision of irreconcilable worlds played itself out. 3 times he was called upon to plead, and 3 times he refused. The prosecutors, led by the relentless John Cook, pressed the astonishing new argument that the king was no more than an officer of the state, entrusted with power by the people and accountable to them for its abuse, that the law stood above the crown and the people above the law. It was a radical and modern claim, one that reached forward toward a wholly new kind of politics, the sovereignty of the governed set against the sovereignty of God's anointed. But Charles would not engage it. To enter any plea, guilty or not, was to concede that the court had the right to put the question, and that single concession he would never make. He stood upon the ground of the divine right, as upon a fortress of the mind that no legal argument could storm. He was not, in his own understanding, a defendant answering a charge. He was the fount of the law itself, and he would not consent to be diminished by the fiction of a trial. The court grew impatient, and then angry. Soldiers packed along the walls of the hall took up the cry for justice and execution. Bradshaw's temper frayed, and still the king remained unmoved, his composure acting as a mirror that forced his captors to look upon the raw fact of their own violence. He was a man who had spent a lifetime mastering his own face, and he would not permit the spectacle of his humiliation to break it now. In those hours he was not the ruler who had failed at statecraft, nor the negotiator who had traded in broken promises. He was a man keeping a stubborn faith with his own soul. He defended not his conduct but the institution of monarchy itself, arguing that if he surrendered to their judgment he would betray the liberties of every Englishman who looked to a lawful king for protection. It was a brilliant and tragic inversion, the man who had been so catastrophic a king proving at the very last a master of the scaffold stage. Because he refused to plead, The court proceeded as though he had confessed. On the 27th of January the sentence was pronounced. The clerk read the doom aloud, that Charles Stuart should be put to death by the severing of his head from his body, and the commissioners rose in a body to signify their assent. In the days that followed, 59 men, some with a steady hand and some with a shaking one, set their names and seals to the warrant that would part the king from the crown and from life together. There was no road back now. The act of regicide, an unthinkable blasphemy to almost every other court in Europe, had become a settled purpose of the English state. In the days that were left to him, held under guard at St. James's Palace, the public king faded and the private man came forward. He was permitted to see only 2 of his children, the ones still within his enemy's reach, the Princess Elizabeth, a grave and clever girl of 13, and the little Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, who was 8. The account of that meeting survives in part because Elizabeth herself set it down soon after, and it shows a father at once tender and unbending. He took the children upon his knees. He urged them to be brave and to forgive the men who had brought him to this pass. He told his small son with great earnestness that he must not let them make him king so long as his elder brothers lived, a warning that revealed how completely his sense of the rightful order of the world held firm even as his own place in it was being struck away. He spoke to them not as a monarch but as a man taking his leave, and knowing that the future he left them would be shaped above all by his death. He passed his final hours in prayer, his movements deliberate, his mind fixed upon the passage he believed he was about to make. He had been a man who loved beauty above almost all things, the patron of Van Dyck and the assembler of the greatest gallery of pictures in the north of Europe, and he had watched that world stripped from him piece by piece, its treasures already marked out to be sold to pay the debts of the war he had lost. Now he laid aside the last of his own defences. He slept little, and when he woke on the morning of the 30th, the air was sharp with a hard midwinter frost. He was composed, his speech clear of every blockage that had shamed his youth, and he asked his servant for a second shirt. For the cold could set a man shivering, and he would not have the watching world mistake a trembling body for a failing spirit. They had built a court to prove that a king was a servant of his people and could be judged by them, and the king had answered them with the one weapon he had left: silence, and the flat refusal to admit that any power on earth stood above an anointed crown. He would not plead because to plead was to concede the court's right to ask, and that he would never do, though it cost him his head. It cost him his head. On the 27th of January they condemned him, and 59 men set their hands to a warrant for the death of their king. There remained to Charles Stuart 3 days of life, and a single cold morning at the end of them. On the morning of the 30th of January 1649, the Thames lay frozen into a jagged, silent shelf of ice, and the air over London held a crystalline, biting sharpness. Charles Stuart, the king who had once reigned over 3 kingdoms and now commanded only the small compass of a bedchamber in St. James's Palace, woke before dawn. He was 48 years old, and he was to die within a few hours. He called for his servant, Thomas Herbert, and asked to be dressed with particular care, requesting a second shirt beneath his clothes. The cold was so punishing, he explained, that were he to shiver, the watching crowd might read the tremor of his body as the tremor of a frightened man. He feared not death, he said, and would not have it thought that he did. The words come to us through Herbert's memoir, set down nearly 30 years afterward, and are best received at that remove. But the gesture itself was of a piece with everything he had made of himself. It was the final exercise of a discipline he had cultivated, since he was the sickly, stammering child left behind in Scotland, to school his face so that it never once betrayed him, and to keep that promise to the very end. He walked from St. James's across the park, ringed by a heavy guard of soldiers, toward the palace of Whitehall. His step was steady and measured, and he spoke now and then to his attendants of the pace they kept, as though he were a gentleman taking a brisk turn through his own gardens on a cold day. He was brought at length into the Banqueting House, the great architectural masterpiece of his father's reign, its ceiling ablaze overhead with Rubens's painted glorification of the Stuart crown and the sacred majesty of kingship. He passed beneath those allegories of divine and everlasting rule, through a hall he had once filled with the finest pictures in Europe, and stepped out through a tall window onto a scaffold draped in black. Before him lay a sea of people held back at a distance by ranks of mounted and foot soldiers drawn up between the king and his subjects. The crowd was vast and unnervingly quiet. Those who stood upon the scaffold with him, among them Bishop William Juxon, who attended him to the last, afterward testified that his voice was calm and even, though the wind and the distance carried his words away, so that almost no one below could make out a syllable of what he said. By the printed accounts assembled in the aftermath, all of which differ a little from one another, the king maintained that he had been the true guardian of his people's liberty, but that their liberty lay in good government and not in a share of it. For a subject and a sovereign were, he said, clean different things. He acknowledged the justice of God's hand upon him, owning that an unjust sentence he had once suffered to take effect was now requited upon himself. The death of Strafford, it was understood, the servant he had abandoned, come back to haunt his own last words. He did not beg for his life. He spoke of passing from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance could be. He declared himself the martyr of the people, and his final word, murmured to Juxon as he made ready, was a single charge whose full meaning he did not explain. Remember. The executioner and his assistant went masked, and the name of the man who did the office has been argued over ever since, without any certain answer. At a given sign the king laid his head upon the low block and stretched out his hands, and with a single stroke it was done. The sound that rose then from the packed streets of Whitehall was not a cheer, but something else entirely. One young witness, Philip Henry, would write in his diary of a groan so deep and so universal that he had never heard the like before, and prayed he never would again. The impossible had happened in the plain light of a winter morning. A people had put their anointed king to death by the sentence of a court of their own making, and no realm in Christendom had ever seen such a thing, for that is the plain and singular fact at the centre of it all. Charles was the only king of England ever tried and executed by his own subjects, and everyone who stood in Whitehall that day understood that the world had been altered past repair. The doctrine of divine right, that inflexible faith which had carried him through every crisis and into this one, had met a nation that no longer held his person sacred. The monarchy was abolished within weeks. England was declared a commonwealth and drifted in time into the military protectorate of Oliver Cromwell. Yet the killing of an anointed king could not, in the end, be made ordinary. It left behind a country that had unmade its crown and could not learn to live without the shadow of it. Within a dozen years, the Republican experiment had worn itself out, and the throne was restored to the dead king's son as Charles II, who would oversee the grim business of hunting down the surviving regicides and putting them, in their turn, to death. The door these men had opened could be walked back through. It could never again be fully closed. The last irony of the king's life lay in the scattering of his beloved collection. Charles had possessed the finest eye of any monarch ever to rule these islands, the patron who had brought Anthony Van Dyck to England and gathered a gallery, Titian and Raphael, Mantegna and Correggio, that had made his court the wonder of connoisseurs across Europe. Now the new republic, hungry for money and eager to be rid of the trappings of fallen majesty, ordered the whole of it appraised and sold. Through the sale of the late king's goods, drawn out over the years after his death, the paintings and statues he had assembled to define his reign were dispersed to the royal houses and private cabinets of the continent, many never to return. The beauty he had spent a lifetime and a fortune gathering was blown to the four winds. Almost at once, and working powerfully against that verdict, came the book. Within days of the execution there appeared a volume titled Icon Basilique, the royal image, purporting to set out the king's private meditations and prayers through his final ordeal. It was a work of extraordinary emotional force, presenting Charles as a gentle, suffering, saintly man wronged by fanatics, and it swept through some 35 editions in its first year alone. Historians generally hold the compilation to be largely the work of a clergyman, John Gordon, who claimed the authorship after the Restoration, though he seems to have worked up some genuine royal material into the whole. The book must never be quoted simply as words the king wrote. However it was made, it did its work. It fixed the image of the martyr king in the popular imagination for generations, set against the pamphlets of his enemies, which had drawn him as a scheming and faithless tyrant who twisted the law to his own appetite. Both portraits were caricatures struck in the heat of a conflict that had cost, by the soberest modern reckoning, a larger share of the people of these islands than any war before the 20th century. The man himself was something more complex and more pitiable than either likeness allowed. He was not the saint the royalists carved from marble, nor the cartoon despot the later Whig historians would set up to knock down. He was a man of genuine private virtue, cursed with a fatal inability to grasp the mind of anyone who opposed him. He held with a sincerity that verged on the tragic that his given word bound him only so far as he chose to be bound, provided it had been wrung from him by men he counted his inferiors, and that single conviction, more than any lost battle, finally persuaded his enemies that no peace could ever be kept with him while he lived. He went to his death as he had lived, sealed within the architecture of his own certainties. And even in the act of killing him, his quiet courage forced his captors to feel the weight of what they did. He died better than he had ruled, and that is the whole difficulty of him. The royalists made him a saint, and printed his sufferings until half of England wept over a book he had almost certainly not written. The men who killed him found they had solved nothing, for you cannot make a nation by unmaking a king, and within a dozen years his son sat where he had sat. Strip away the martyr and the tyrant both, and what remains is stranger and sadder than either. A shy, stammering second son who never wanted the crown and never learned to wear it. A devoted husband, a tender father, the finest eye for beauty of any king who ever ruled here. Sincere and brave and impossible. A good man who was a catastrophe. He went from a corruptible crown to an incorruptible one, he said, where no disturbance can be. He left a very great disturbance behind him, and a door standing open that England would spend 3 centuries learning how to close.